There's breaking news coming out of DC Comics. They have not waited very long to replace Daniel Cherry III, who has escaped out the back door to go work for Kanye West. In is Anne DePies as a new general manager for DC Comics. There's some good aspects about this hiring. There's some bad aspects about this hiring. I'm going to read the report from newsarama.com. I'm going to give my thoughts after each paragraph. Like I said, there's some good stuff. There's some bad stuff. This is all breaking. Obviously, we will cover it in much more depth and detail on this weekend's Comics Aficionados. But here's the news as it's happening right now. Following the recent departure of Daniel Cherry III, Warner Media Global Brands and Experiences has announced the immediate appointment of Anne DePies, a new senior vice president and general manager of DC Comics. Obviously, this is a very important position, and they've decided that potentially hiring from outside the comic book industry was a bad idea because Anne DePies has actually been with Warner Brothers and with DC Comics for a very long time. So I think they've learned their mistake that hiring outside of comics was a bad idea, and certainly hiring a marketing guru that has been job hopping in their entire career probably wasn't going to provide stability for their publisher, which was bad news from the beginning. We could have probably seen this thing coming before it even happened. But they've obviously learned a little bit from their mistake as they have hired from within, and essentially, I don't know if it's promotion, but they've certainly moved them over to a more high-profile, high-visibility position within DC Comics as far as the public and customers are concerned. DePies, who fills the role that Cherry exited, will report to Pam Lifford, president, Warner Media Global Brands and Experiences. According to the announcement, DePies will be responsible for the operations, revenue, legal, marketing, brand management, and strategic planning of the DC business, and will especially focus on driving the publisher's international and digital expansion. Now, that last part is very important because this falls absolutely within Anne DePies' wheelhouse as far as their experience with DC Comics. And for the most part, pretty much all their experience was within comic books, as far as I can tell, as far as the jobs that they've held. It says next, she will also partner with DC publisher and chief creative officer Jim Lee on creative, talent, and editorial decisions to support and drive what is called DC's aggressive story and character and digital plans, along with its continuing commitment to direct market comic book retailers. Now, here is the issue. It says that she is going to have a large part in creative, talent, and editorial decisions. When you look at the scope of that, which is mostly what's going to affect you and I, the readers, they essentially have no experience whatsoever. So they're going to be she's going to be leaning heavily on Jim Lee, who seems to take no part whatsoever in these decisions whatsoever. You also have Marie Yavins over there as the EIC, who hasn't seemed to make many good decisions since they've been in place. As somebody that has been a leader in the past, and I have certainly come into positions where I have a team in place that are working, whether they're good or bad. If you are unfamiliar with exactly what you're doing, one of the first things that you have to do is you have to lean on the people that are already there. Jim Lee seems to have taken no interest or direct action in fixing anything that currently ails DC Comics. Marie Yavins is the same. So if Anne DePies is to be an agent of change and make things better at DC Comics, and maybe not relying so heavily on Batman, there's going to be another video on that out in the very in the very near future, probably today. You're not going to see any change because Anne DePies is going to have to lean on Marie Yavins and the group editors currently in place, and for the most part, go with the status quo, because the parts of the job that will directly affect us, they have literally no experience with. She's not going to be able to go in there and say, listen, your direction with Batman is bad. She literally has no experience with doing creative direction on Batman. She's not going to be able to go in there and say, you know what, Vita Ayala is a terrible decision to put on Nubia and the Amazons. Or hiring Teenie Howard to come in and take over the Catwoman book from Ram V is a terrible decision because one of them's a good writer and the other one isn't. She doesn't know any of that stuff. It sounds like she's a reader, but she doesn't know the in and outs and probably the current status of DC Comics to a degree that you would get immediate and effective change. We just talked about a couple of days ago 5 things that DC could do to really affect and improve things within their publisher. And it was bringing in people that knew all this stuff. Here, they're bringing in a general manager that is going to, focus mostly on driving the publisher's international and digital expansion. Certainly they have experience, but this part where they're going to be working on creative talent and editorial decisions, no experience whatsoever, and there will be no immediate dividends to you and I, the readers, or the retailers, or anybody that enjoys DC Comics. That, to me, is a major folly with this hiring that I can see immediately. Now, I could be wrong on this. This is all very preliminary, but just reading over through their business experience and what they've done at DC and Warner Brothers, this is an enormous gaping black hole in their resume. And it was the same thing with Daniel Cherry. They are not going to be able to affect positive change at DC Comics because they have no experience doing it. They go on and they talk about from Lifford herself, Pam Lifford, the Warner Brothers executive that essentially oversees DC Comics. She says, Anne's deep knowledge and appreciation of the DC business, legacy, and people will be invaluable in this new leadership role. She understands our fans, characters, and stories, and along with Jim, will passionately build our DC publishing business to even greater heights. The business part, absolutely. As far as understanding fans, characters, and stories, I don't believe that whatsoever. That has never been in their job purview whatsoever. I think Pam Lifford is obviously being it's public speak, right? You do it a press release, you're going to build the person up as much as possible. I'm sure Pam, Jim Lee, and the other people know that that is an enormous black hole within their experience set. They continued on. This is what Jim Lee had to say about the hiring. I worked with Anne for over a decade, and what impresses me is that she gets the importance of story. She understands it is our foundation, and she has literally woven it into our business plan, which speaks volumes as to the future she envisions for DC. I'm super excited for this partnership and what is to come next. There's no indication from anything that I've seen that Anne DePies has ever had an active part in building and executing stories for DC Comics. I think they're building the person up. She just got hired, so they're gonna put their best foot forward. But this is corporate speak. They know as well as I do that if you look at their experience at DC Comics, the idea that she's literally woven story and understands that story is the foundation of DC Comics into their business plan is ridiculous. And here's why. They talk about the experience that DePies has had. DePies has been with DC since 2011, and her latest position was Senior Vice President, Global Brands and Franchises. Does that sound like someone that's been in the trenches helping develop and execute Batman stories, someone that's been in the trenches and weaving story as the foundation of DC Comics into their business plan? Sure, I'm certain she's aware of story and how they could potentially market these things globally and incorporate them in there. But there's no expectation with that job title that they ever would have been in the trenches, incorporating story in a business plan. They would have been on the very back end of that. Here's the story. Here's what we're doing. Here's a marketing strategy. Now you go and do your thing with your global brands and franchises part. And it says that before moving to DC, DePies focused on acquisitions across Warner Brothers, theatrical, television, and video game units. Does that sound like someone that's weaving story into business plans? No, they're overselling what DePies is bringing to the story as far as creative, because they are going to be making the decisions based on creative, editorial, hiring writers and artists. Literally no experience doing that. This is what DePies themselves had to say. It is incredibly humbling to step into this role at a place I've been for a while now. I feel like I partially grew up at DC, and I've seen how important we are to our fans. To get the chance to lead our company to do even more for them is a dream come true. I'm sure it is. This is probably a great job for them. And by all accounts, unlike Daniel Cherry III, Anne DePies likes comic books and reads them. So that's a plus going in here. But there's also, there's the blatant, like the big flashing red light that's staring you in the face when you read this thing and you realize this person has been associated with DC Comics over a decade. Sure, they didn't get fired when they got rid of all the executives. But they had the senior vice president position in mind, general manager position in mind when they did the hiring, and they passed her over. This was an internal candidate that had been with the company, been working with DC Properties, comic books wise, for over a decade, had been working with Warner Brothers as far as acquisitions even longer, and they passed her over. This is the safe choice at this point. Was it the right choice to begin with? Potentially. But as a fan, as a reader, you and I don't really care about their initiatives to expand internationally in digital expansion. Those things are very important. I don't think that they're going to improve upon their DC Universe app at any point in the near future. And it's not even available right now for most markets overseas. Certainly not available here in the Philippines. If I'm reading my comic books digitally, it's going to be through Comixology. They could have hired this person already. The fact that they are going to have a part in creative talent and editorial decisions it's a red flag. Now there's a chance a lot of people, they're just good at what they do no matter what they do. Anne DePies could be that person. No matter what position you put them in, they're always going to excel. And they could pick up the baton and run with it and do great things at DC Comics, but it's not going to be immediate because they do not have the experience as far as hiring talent, working on creative and editorial decisions. They just don't. So they're going to be leaning on the people that are already there. So if you're expecting short-term change, short-term improvement at DC Comics, this hiring is not going to do that. But it is an acknowledgement that DC Comics got it wrong in the first place by hiring outside the comic book industry. They probably should have hired somebody that had knowledge of the product and what they were doing. Daniel Cherry III brought none of that to the table. When you look at all the things that Anne DePies is going to be doing, and we've highlighted the things that they should fit into very well and the things that they shouldn't, Daniel Cherry brought none of it. He brought marketing to the table. Did their marketing get better? Doesn't feel like it. He brought one success his entire time, and that was Batman Fortnite. Otherwise, DC Comics have gotten worse since he arrived there as the senior vice president and general manager. This is probably a step in the right direction, but as a reader, it doesn't feel like this is going to improve things anytime soon. If you would like to know how I would change things for the better, I had a video talking about the 5 things I would do to improve DC Comics. We'd bring in some more experienced people with the characters and stories. Let's just put it that way. Spoilers right there.